Today on Game & Read, Ollie Ollie Open Relationships.
Hello and welcome to Game & Read. I'm Erin.
And my name is Peter.
And today is another episode of Friday Reads. We tell you what we were reading last week, what we're reading this weekend, and we share a recommendation or two, usually books and video games, but sometimes other things.
Yes, this is our weekly timely episode. It's the one that we record just 2 days before it goes out, and is totally different than our actual full pairings, which you can always check out on our feeds. Following up on my game from last week. Last week I played Ollie Ollie 2, Welcome to Ollywood, the Ollie Oxenfree game.
Every time you say Ollie Ollie, it makes me think of Roly Poly Oly, which I know is not all the same.
Small and Smurf and round.
And I love the idea that you're playing as Roly Poly Oly on a skateboard.
That would probably make this a little bit cuter. It's a game I do enjoy, but let me go into my thoughts on it. I think this is a really good sequel to the original one. I know I mentioned last week that I played the original a good amount, and this was kind of a nice iterative, bump on that game. They added a manual so you can do really long combos across the whole level. They added a revert so you can land, do a revert, go into a manual, and have more control over your direction. They get really pretty technical with it, which is cool when you think about like, oh man, I can do all this cool stuff, and then you realize it's pretty hard to do that, and the learning curve to get good at it was a little steep, I'd say, for something that is just kind of a funsy side-scrolling skateboard game. I know when they first came out, they had kind of a high score mode and leaderboards and all that, but now in hindsight, when you don't have that hooked up anymore, because I couldn't connect to it, so I don't think it exists anymore, it's more just like, man, this game is probably a little bit tougher than I personally want it to be. And I say that both as somebody who's like, who likes feeling like they're bad at a game, but also when you do something really cool and you do a hard trick, it doesn't always look as impressive on the screen as it actually should be based on the points it's giving you. So despite being a kind of goofy, unrealistic environments, all that jazz, all the tricks are kind of bare bones what they actually look like in like a little 2D sprite. And they do those animations well, but they just aren't as exhilarating as, say, some of the cool animations you can do in like the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games, where it's like when you do a Christ air in that, it's like, holy cow, those guys are just flying through the air. You didn't get quite that like fun like superhero skateboard vibe in Ollie Ollie.
Is it that it just felt like not a... Like it needed more gamification of the tricks, like the visuals? Was it like too muted? Is that sort of how it comes across?
Well, I think they kind of created these like kind of fun, dynamic, themed worlds, and they'll give you a bunch within that theme. So they'll be like, here's the Wild West theme, because it's like you're in Ollywood, so it's all kind of movie sets and stuff. And within each of those sets, they have kind of a fun theme, and it's a little goofy, and you're grinding on like roller coaster rails. But then your guy just looks like a little skate dude, just doing very like normal skate tricks over ridiculous things. And I feel like they could have zhuzhed it up a little bit. Maybe they could have added some different avatar options, like something silly and cute, or fun other indie characters, because I know sometimes there's crossover between indie games. And I think that would have made it a little bit more fun to watch, because I feel like when I was playing this game, I was just kind of looking at the ground right in front of where my guy was going to land, because it was like, oh, how much time do I have before I hit the ground? I got to nail the trick quickly. I got to get the timing right. And it just made it less of a spectacle and more of like twist the joystick at the right time and it didn't really feel holistic in that way. That being said, I do think it's a fun game, and certainly at the earlier parts, it's really enjoyable and fun to just be like doing cool tricks, riding around, getting the hang of timing your landings is, a little tricky at first, but it gets pretty fun and rewarding where you're like, yeah, I nailed that landing, got a huge combo, feels good. And I would say I still recommend this if you want to pick it up and that sounds intriguing to you. But there are just a few things where it's like, yeah, I think they could have tweaked it a little bit more and given a few more like fun, flashy options to just make it a little bit more, like add a bit more like the fun in quotes. Like not necessarily changing the gameplay, but adding like some of the visual fun.
Matching the visuals to the sets, to the extravagance of the actual skate sets that you're going through.
Yeah, so, Ollie Ollie and Ollie Ollie 2, like I said in the last week's episode, if you pick it up as a pair, they're pretty fun, and you can have a nice couple of days with them, I think, but it's not something that I'm going to always want to go back to, I don't think.
Last week, my Friday Reads was Lester by Raven Leilani, and I think that this is a really interesting book. It is about Edie. She is 23, working in a publishing job, living in a really shitty apartment in New York. And she gets involved with an older man, married in an open marriage, has an adopted daughter, lives in New Jersey. And it's about their relationship. And I think that I'm not old. I'm 29. The protagonist is 23. So, like, yeah, obviously younger than me, but not, like, by a lot.
Yeah, I would say early 20s versus late 20s. For a lot of people, those are two distinct time periods.
Well, and the reason I bring that up is because I thought that the writing was beautiful. I think that it was emotional, and it was really raw and genuine and really lovely to read. But I struggled to connect with anyone in the book because the characters are Edie, who's this 23-year-old who just like has sex with lots of different men, is, working at this job she hates, living in a really horrible apartment, not following sort of the passions that she had as a younger teen. So that's one. And then you have her lover, who is, like 50-something, 60-something-year-old white man.
Oh, he's that old.
Yeah. So
okay. I was picturing like a 35 to 45-year-old.
No, maybe he's in like his late 40s, early to mid 50s. He's somewhere around that range. He's just skeezy. His wife, who I could not connect with at all. They have an adopted daughter who's like 13. And there's a really interesting relationship between Edie and the daughter, but so I think that this is a book that I would recommend, but with the asterisk that it's not, for me, it wasn't about connecting with the characters as much it was about experiencing the writing and the viewpoint. And it was just a really interesting slice of life. It's not plot driven by any means. It's just this sort of slice of Edie's experience, her professional, her personal, her love life. So I would recommend it if that sounds interesting. Like I said, I loved the writing. I think the writing is just fantastic. So yeah, it was a great on some ends and sort of just fine on others. That I have a hard time articulating it. It's a book that like I enjoyed the experience of reading it a lot.
Did you like the writing enough that you would read something else by the same author?
Absolutely.
Okay.
This was Raven Leilani's debut novel, and I would absolutely pick another book up by her. I would totally read something else she's written.
Heading into our picks for this particular weekend, my game for this Friday is Enter the Gungeon. Enter the Gungeon was developed by Dodgeroll and published by Devolver Digital. It came out originally in 2016 and is currently available on pretty much everything. All the consoles, PC, whatever you have, you can play it. This is a multi-hyphenate game. It is a bullet hell, top-down, roguelike shooter game. Dungeon crawler.
It's a chaos machine. From what I've watched, in the tiny snippets, it's like my worst game nightmare because it's just like so many things are happening all the time.
Yes, you make your way through the aforementioned Gungeon, which is a dungeon based around guns, and you are trying to make it down to the bottom of it to find its mysteries, its treasures, whatever it has hidden for you. And you control one of 4 kind of archetypical characters as you pursue this goal. That being said, the Gungeon is filled with lots of enemies, mostly gun-themed, who all try and shoot you with various very deadly weapons, and you have to shoot them back before they get you and avoid getting hit too much. Otherwise, you die, and you have to start the whole thing over again. If you're unfamiliar with what a roguelike is, I'm not going to get into the full history of it, but basically it is a tough game where you need to it's permadeath. So there's no save point, on the second level that'll let you keep going from there every time. You have to work from the beginning as you go. They do let you kind of add some things as you go along, so you can unlock new weapons that you can find in the Gungeon. You can eventually kind of build this elevator that'll take you lower down, but the challenges to get those things are pretty high, and it's kind of the intent is you get good enough and you have a really good run and you make it to the end.
So when you say permadeath, do you keep the things that you've discovered? Like when you say build an elevator, like can you get the pieces of this elevator throughout time, or can you like upgrade your character over time, even though you die? When you die every time, you start over?
You start with a base set of stuff as a character, so if you're playing as the Marine. So if it's not clear from this, I have been playing this some already, but I'm planning to play through it, and I haven't beaten it yet, so that's kind of where I'm at with this game. If you're playing as, say, the Marine character, you have your standard pistol you start with, your kind of secondary backup thing, and then a couple other features with it. When you enter, that's all you have to start with, and you have to find all your guns, all your keys, all your money in the randomly generated levels. So every time you go back in, it's going to be laid out differently. What's available to you is totally randomized, and what enemies you'll face is random too. So there are some enemies that can be, depending on your playstyle, maybe a little bit trickier. There are some bosses that I definitely prefer fighting to others, and there are a couple that I still haven't quite figured out how to take them down effectively.
So you start with the same set of weapons or same set of equipment every time, regardless of what you found in your last run.
Yes. So
gotcha.
If you find a really awesome gun and then you die immediately after, you don't have that gun anymore. You have to find it again.
Gotcha. Okay. I just know that there are some... and maybe this is just my very limited knowledge. I feel like there are some games that you die, but you get to keep shit. And so you build upon it.
So there are some games that might be like that. The roguelike genre is getting pretty wide. It's become fairly popular, especially there's now a new game out called Hades that has been very popular, and that falls into the roguelike genre of things changing and needing to get that one run through. And I've played a couple other things that qualify as roguelike, things like Dead Cells that I'll probably do again as a Friday Reads at some point in the future because I want to revisit that game. So it really kind of depends. The most standard way I have seen is that you go back to having nothing, but there might be like a kind of permanent change depending on, the game and how their design works. And that's why they're called roguelikes and not just rogue games, because there's not a strict rote definition of what that has to be, but it's kind of a loose, fun interpretation that yields some pretty fun games that tend to get well liked in the community, assuming they're made pretty well. There was a sequel published for Enter the Gungeon called Exit the Gungeon. It is similar in that it's a roguelike, however, instead of being a top-down kind of dungeon crawler style, it is more of a side-scrolling platformer, but you similarly are killing the same enemies with guns, trying to get out of the Gungeon. And that came out at the end of last year in 2019, and I believe is available on like Apple Arcade and Switch. I think might be the only two places right now. It's a more limited release than Enter the Gungeon at the moment, probably based on some sort of exclusivity contracts. But that's available too. I'd be interested in playing that sometime, just based on how much I like this first one so far. And that's what I'll be playing this weekend.
My Friday reads this week is Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. And you might remember a couple weeks ago, I recommended Gyasi's first novel, Homegoing. Transcendent Kingdom is her new book. It just came out at the beginning of September. I got it from Book of the Month, and I am super excited to read it. It is about a woman who is a PhD candidate in neuroscience in the United States at Stanford, and there are a lot of suffering in her family. She's got a brother with opioid addiction. Her mother is suicidal, and she is really a big motivation for her PhD is to try and understand the suffering of her family members and how it relates to neuroscience and what's going on in their brains. So, yeah, Gyasi is just, I raved about her when I recommended Homegoing, and I'm sure I will rave about her again next week when I tell you about this book. But she's just such a phenomenal author, and this is so very different from Homegoing in terms of setting. This is set fully in the United States. It sounds like in the modern times. It seems that, you know, at least like the 2010s, so recent, and I'm really excited to read this book. I haven't started it, so I really don't have any other. I try to stay away from reviews or like lots of information about books that I want to read because I don't want to get spoiled, or I don't want to get I don't want to know too much. But I am really excited to pick up Transcendent Kingdom. So that's what I'll be reading this weekend. Looking forward to talking more about it.
This week for recommendations, I don't have a game anniversary or anything like that to celebrate. However, I did go ahead and watch the recently released Console Wars documentary that was put out on CBS All Access, I believe, about a week ago. This is based on the 2014 book by Blake Harris. That's a book I picked up back in 2014. I read about half of it and stopped reading it.
It's still sitting on our shelf.
No, I think I got rid of it, didn't I?
I don't know.
I think
it was
I got
there
rid
for a
of it.
long time.
I think, yes. Well, I read about half of it, and I stopped there because I really was not that interested in it. Not necessarily because of Blake Harris's writing style, but maybe more just the subject matter. And now watching a 90-minute filmed version of that, I feel fairly justified in that decision 6 years ago. I don't think this is the most interesting story. It tells the story of the console wars of Sega versus Nintendo in the early to mid 90s, and kind of all the different tactics those two sides took while trying to get, you know, the one up on each other, while Sega was trying to snatch some of that console market share from Nintendo.
Marketing. How do we get people to buy our shit?
Right, and as somebody who enjoys plenty of games from around then and loves Nintendo and has a more recent appreciation for modern Sega back then, I could take it or leave it, honestly. However, this is not about the video games. It's not about the consoles. This is a film and a book about marketing and executives. So if you're into that, check this out. You'll probably learn something new, especially if you're not already familiar with this story. However, there is 0 interviews with anybody who developed a game or developed a console. It is all just marketing people, basically the suits who found ways to be like, oh, what if we made this loud and brash in our advertising for Altered Beast and Sonic the Hedgehog? And I did not find it all that engaging or very interesting. Mind you, I was already fairly familiar with it, so maybe if it was a brand new story to me, I would have liked it a bit more.
So is this a recommendation to not watch it?
This is a recommendation. If you are working on your MBA and you don't know this story, watch this. You might learn something cool. If you are super interested in advertisements from the early 90s, watch this because there's probably something interesting for you. If you actually want to see them talk about the games and what they were making and the creative process of Nintendo versus Sega at the time, I don't think this is something I would recommend. So I watched it with the intention of maybe recommending it, but I really did not come down on that side of it. Interestingly enough, this documentary was produced by Seth Rogen, among other people.
I just don't understand.
Well, and here's the story behind that is that Seth Rogen and his writing partner, Evan Goldberg? Something like that. The guy who he writes all his stuff with, but is less famous than him. They bought the film rights to this book right when it came out. I think right before it was published. I don't know if they're friends with Harris or if they just heard about it and were really into it. And they bought that in 2014. And my understanding is that they had the full intention of making a semi-fictionalized film, or at least a acted out film about this. And I guess that just never came to fruition in 6 years. And so eventually they were like, well, let's make a documentary and put it on CBS All Access. So if you have access to CBS All Access, you might be able to watch this. Otherwise, I would probably just go back and say, watch High Score on Netflix. It'll kind of scratch the same itch, but was honestly a lot more entertaining and interesting and diverse.
It is October, which means that we're in spooky
when did that happen?
Fall season. And so this week I am recommending Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. It's Muir. Muir. I don't know.
I believe it's pronounced Muir, like Muir Woods in Northern California.
I'm sorry. It's Tamsyn. It's a weird name, but it's called Gideon
It's in the notes.
Ninth.
Check the notes.
It's in the description in the notes. You'll find it with a link. But I am recommending Gideon the Ninth. It is weird as hell. If you are not into dark sci-fi fantasy, this book is not for you. But if you are into sci-fi fantasy dark shit, pick it up. It's fantastic. Basically, Gideon the Ninth. Gideon is a woman who is living. It's this weird hellscape of a society out in space. But the long and short of it is that she ends up being essentially a guardian to the princess of her planet. And they have been summoned to this basically a neutral planet to try to learn necromancy, intense power. And of course, people die. Things are necromancy, shit gets crazy, and Gideon has no training as a guard. She's just thrown into it. There's lots of trickery and deceit, and there's a very vile relationship between her and the princess she is serving. But it is fantastic. I don't want to say anything more about it because this is a book I really think you just gotta think sounds interesting and you pick it up and you go. But it is it's dark. It's got gory stuff, not horribly gory, but definitely not for the weak-willed. There's a mystery. There are some insane characters. It's like a space shenanigans. It's fantastic. Plus, the book has black edges on the paper, which just makes it extra fun on your shelf. If you are a seasonal reader and if you like reading spooky, dark things during fall and going into winter, absolutely pick this one up. There is a sequel that is out. I have not read it yet, but I am very excited to get it, hopefully during this spooky season, and give it a read. So my recommendation, Gideon the Ninth, Tamsyn Muir. Check the notes for a link and the actual spelling.
That's all we have for this week's episode of Friday Reads. As always, you can find and subscribe to this podcast on pretty much any podcatcher. I just submitted to Amazon Podcasts, which is a thing now. So we're on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and now Amazon Podcasts as well. Check it out wherever you find your casts.
You can also find us on social media. I have a Twitter at BookishTextPat, and a bookstagram with my mom. It's A Tale of Two Shelves.
I am also on Twitter. My handle is now just @GameAndRead. We also have a Instagram with that same handle, so type it into those things and find us there.
Our intro music was written and performed by Avery Murchison, and there is a link to his Bandcamp in the description.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.
Game and Read.
That's all. Voice crack.
Okay, 14-year-old Peter.
Time to change.